This is the path we take. From the farm, we strike here, straight to Jerusalem.
The summer of 1831 in Southampton County, Virginia, was marked by an atmospheric disquiet that unsettled both the planter class and the enslaved population. To the scientific community of the era, the phenomena were puzzling. To the inhabitants of the Tidewater region, they were harbingers. In mid-August, a peculiar haze descended upon the eastern United States. The sun, typically a searing yellow presence over the tobacco and cotton fields, underwent a chromatic transformation, appearing in the sky as a distinct bluish-green orb. This optical anomaly was not merely a local weather event, but the result of global stratospheric disturbances. Modern climatological reconstruction suggests the cause was the dispersal of sulfuric aerosols from a massive volcanic eruption. While contemporary speculation often pointed to local miasmas, subsequent analysis identifies the likely source as the eruption of Mount St. Helens in the Pacific Northwest, or, more probatively, the submarine eruption of Ferdinandea off the coast of Sicily, which occurred in July 1831. The volcanic plume, transported by stratospheric winds, acted as a spectral filter, scattering sunlight and casting a pallid, cerulean light across the Virginia landscape. For the general population, this blue sun was a curiosity recorded in almanacs. For Nat Turner, it was the final, irrevocable signal to commence a war. On the afternoon of Sunday, August 21, 1831, under this strange sky, a conspiratorial nucleus formed deep within the woods near Cabin Pond. The location was strategic, remote, shielded by dense cypress swamps and underbrush, and removed from the surveillance of overseers. The men who gathered there were the lieutenants of the insurrection: Hark, Henry, Sam, Nelson, Will, and Jack. They were not merely followers. They were men of specific talents and immense fortitude, trusted implicitly by Turner. Hark, owned by Joseph Travis, was described as a man of magnificent physique and intelligence, often likened to a black Hercules in later accounts. Nat Turner arrived late to the gathering, a deliberate entrance that underscored his role as the visionary architect of the plot. At 30 years old, Turner presented a striking figure. He was slightly below average height, 5 feet 6 or 8 inches, but possessed a broad, powerful build. His physical description, later circulated in reward proclamations, noted distinct markings: a scar on his temple, another on the back of his neck, and a large knot on his right wrist, the calcified remnant of a prior blow. His complexion was described as bright, and he walked with a brisk, active gait. The atmosphere at Cabin Pond was heavy with the gravity of the impending action. The men feasted on a roast pig and engaged in the final operational planning. While the men had brought provisions, Turner, known for his ascetic discipline, abstained from indulgences, focusing entirely on the logistical and spiritual dimensions of the task. The plan was stark in its totality. They would strike that very night. The operational strategy devised by Turner was rooted in psychological warfare and silence. The insurgents determined that the initial phase of the rebellion must be conducted without firearms to avoid alerting the countryside. They would rely on axes, hatchets, and swords. The objective was to move rapidly from farm to farm, neutralizing the white population, men, women, and children, to prevent any escapees from raising the alarm. This work of death, as Turner termed it, was not a wanton massacre in his eyes, but a tactical necessity to destabilize the institution of slavery through absolute terror. As twilight deepened, the blue sun faded into a humid, suffocating darkness. The men extinguished their fire. The group, numbering only 7 at this stage, prepared to move. They possessed a singular advantage: the element of surprise. The county slept, secure in the belief that the enslaved population was docile, unaware that the atmospheric omens of the past week were about to manifest as a physical storm. The planning complete, the small band emerged from the swamp's cover, stepping onto the dirt road that led toward the sleeping household of Joseph Travis, where the first blow would be struck. It was past midnight, the early hours of Monday, August 22, 1831, when the insurgents reached the boundary of the Travis homestead. The farm was silent. Joseph Travis, Nat's legal master, was a wheelwright and farmer who had married the widow of Nat's former owner, Thomas Moore. By all accounts, Travis was considered a kind master who had not subjected Nat to excessive cruelty and placed great confidence in him. This perceived benevolence, however, afforded him no protection. In the calculus of the rebellion, Travis represented the head of the system in their immediate vicinity, and his removal was the requisite first act of liberation. The insurgents approached the main house with extreme caution. The strategy of silence was paramount. Any noise, a barking dog, a gunshot, a scream, could precipitate a premature end to the uprising. Hark, utilizing his strength and agility, placed a ladder against the chimney to gain access to the upper floor. The plan was to descend from the inside and unbar the doors for the rest of the group. The infiltration was successful. The door swung open without sound, and the 7 men stood in the darkened hallway of the house. They moved toward the master bedroom where Joseph Travis and his wife Sally lay asleep. In the room with them was an infant in a cradle. In an adjacent room slept Putnam Moore, the young boy who held the legal title to Nat. The air in the room was still, the breathing of the sleepers the only sound. Nat Turner later recounted that the heavy responsibility of the first kill fell to him. He was the architect of the moment, and it was fitting that he strike the initial blow. In the darkness, he raised a hatchet. The adrenaline, the darkness, or perhaps a flicker of hesitation caused his aim to drift. He struck Joseph Travis, but the blow was glancing, hitting the side of his head rather than a fatal point. The silence was shattered. Travis, wounded and bewildered, sprang up in bed, shouting for his wife. The situation threatened to spiral into chaos. If Travis could reach a weapon or escape the room, the rebellion would be strangled in its cradle. At this critical juncture, Will, the man who had joined the conspiracy with a ferocious commitment, stepped out of the shadows. He did not hesitate. Wielding a broadaxe, Will struck Travis with a precision that Nat had lacked, silencing him instantly. The violence that followed was swift and methodical. Sally Travis was killed next, followed by the young Putnam Moore. The insurgents moved with a grim efficiency, securing the firearms and gunpowder stored in the house, vital acquisitions for the battles ahead. Having neutralized the adults and the young owner, the group exited the house into the yard. They began to organize their next move, drilling the men and preparing to march to the next farm. However, a realization halted them. In the chaotic sequence of the attack, the infant sleeping in the cradle had been overlooked. The logic of the rebellion, as articulated by Turner, was total. Nits make lice was a common aphorism of the time used in various conflicts to justify the killing of children, and though Turner did not use this phrase recordedly, the sentiment of total erasure guided their actions. To leave a survivor was to leave a witness and a future enemy. Nat turned to 2 of his men. He instructed them to return to the house and complete the work. The 2 men detached from the group and walked back toward the dark, silent structure. As the 2 men disappeared back into the shadow of the Travis house to extinguish the final spark of life within, the narrative hangs suspended in the humid night air, leaving the fate of the rebellion's first hour to be resolved at the end. To comprehend the forces that propelled Nat Turner to the bloody threshold of the Travis house, one must examine the 30 years of history that forged his psychology. Born on October 2, 1800, Nat entered a world already vibrating with the tension of insurrection. His birth occurred exactly 1 week before the execution of Gabriel Prosser, a literate enslaved blacksmith who had organized a massive, though thwarted, rebellion in Richmond. In the oral history of the enslaved community, this timing was not coincidental. Many viewed Nat as the spiritual heir to Prosser's revolutionary intent. From his infancy, Nat was marked by an aura of the extraordinary. He was born with physical excrescences, scars or markings on his head and chest, that African cultural traditions and the local enslaved community interpreted as signs of a diviner or prophet. His grandmother and mother, the latter possibly of direct African descent, nurtured this perception, telling him he was intended for a great purpose. His intellectual capabilities manifested early and were startling to both black and white observers. Without formal schooling, Nat acquired literacy. He was discovered spelling out names in books and experimenting with the manufacture of paper and gunpowder, a clear indication of a mind seeking both knowledge and agency. His master's son, Samuel Turner, remarked on his brightness, and for a time Nat was permitted to read and study, particularly the Bible. This access to Scripture was transformative. Nat did not merely read the text, he internalized the apocalyptic language of the Old Testament. He became a preacher, a spiritual leader, who abstained from the social release of plantation life, parties, drinking, and fraternizing to devote himself to fasting and prayer. He was a man apart, wrapped in mystery and self-imposed isolation. The defining crisis of his young adulthood occurred in 1821. At the age of 21, having been placed under a harsh overseer, Nat Turner ran away. For 30 days he lived as a fugitive in the woods. He had achieved what every enslaved person coveted: freedom. He had the intelligence and the skills to potentially navigate north or disappear into the great dismal swamp. However, after a month of liberty, Nat Turner voluntarily returned to the plantation. His return baffled the enslaved community. They ridiculed him, calling him a fool for submitting to slavery when he had escaped it, saying that, "If they had my sense, they would not serve any master in the world." But Nat's return was not an act of submission. It was an act of obedience to a different authority. His mission was not individual escape, which he viewed as selfish but collective deliverance. By returning, he demonstrated that his body could be enslaved, but his will belonged entirely to the visions that were beginning to consume him. He accepted the yoke again, but this time, he wore it as a disguise. The return in 1821 marked the end of Nat Turner's personal ambition and the beginning of his messianic destiny, setting the stage for the decade of visions that would map the road to insurrection. Throughout the 1820s, Nat Turner lived in two worlds: the brutal, repetitive reality of plantation labor and a vivid, hallucinated landscape of spiritual warfare. As he worked the fields of Southampton County, the physical world began to dissolve into a tapestry of omens. In 1825, the visions intensified. While laboring, Nat looked up to see lights in the sky. He interpreted these illuminations as the combat of spiritual armies. He described seeing white spirits and black spirits engaged in battle, with the sun darkening and thunder rolling, a premonition of the racial conflict he believed was inevitable. The natural world became a cryptogram. He found drops of blood on the corn in the fields, which he perceived as dew from heaven, symbolizing the blood of Christ returning to earth to redeem the oppressed. In the woods, he discovered leaves etched with what he identified as hieroglyphic characters and numbers, drawn in blood, depicting men in various attitudes of war. To Turner, these were not random patterns of nature, but divine tactical maps. For 3 years, Turner held this secret. He continued to work for Joseph Travis, maintaining the facade of the obedient, trusted slave, while his mind honed the details of the apocalypse. The first sign arrived in February 1831. A solar eclipse darkened the sun, casting a shadow over the region. Turner interpreted this as the hand of a black man covering the sun, a cosmic validation that the time for the rising was at hand. The seal was removed from his lips. He began to recruit his inner circle: Hark, Henry, Nelson, and Sam. The original date for the uprising was set for July 4, 1831. The symbolism was deliberate. Turner intended to seize the promise of Independence Day for his own people. However, as the date approached, the immense psychological and physical strain of the plot caused Turner to fall ill. The opportunity passed. This delay could have been fatal. Conspiracies are notoriously fragile. but his lieutenants remained silent, a testament to their loyalty and Turner's commanding influence. Then came the final trigger. On August 13, 1831, the blue sun phenomenon occurred. The eerie volcanic light that bathed Virginia was interpreted by Turner as the modification of the sign he had waited for. It was the signal to move. The plan they finalized was ruthless. They would start at the Travis home and move eastward, gathering recruits and arms. They targeted the county seat, Jerusalem, hoping to seize the armory and hold the town as a fortress. They would kill all white inhabitants to prevent the alarm from spreading. They would use the element of surprise to overwhelm the isolated farmhouses before the militia could organize. The signs had been read, the date set, and the weapons sharpened. The years of visions were about to manifest as a night of carnage across the Southampton countryside. The rebellion, once unleashed, moved with a terrifying velocity. After leaving the Travis farm, the insurgents, now armed with muskets and gunpowder, proceeded to the home of Salathiel Francis. The discipline of the group remained intact. They knocked on the door, and when Francis opened it, they dragged him out and killed him instantly. The silence held. No gunshots were fired. They moved on to the home of Piety Reese, where they killed Mrs. Reese and her son in their beds. By the early morning hours, the band had grown to 15 men. They reached the farm of Wiley Francis. Here, the momentum met its first obstacle. Wiley Francis, alerted either by the noise or by loyal slaves, was awake and armed. He confronted the insurgents. Realizing they had lost the element of surprise and facing armed resistance, the rebels chose not to engage in a protracted siege. They retreated and moved toward more vulnerable targets. The violence reached its zenith at the home of Catherine "Katie" Whitehead. The attack here was particularly brutal. The insurgents killed the entire family, Katie, her mother, and 5 children. It was at this location that Nat Turner, who had largely delegated the physical killing to his lieutenants Will and Hark, committed his only murder with his own hands. He pursued Margaret Whitehead, the daughter, into the field. After his sword failed to kill her, he picked up a fence rail and beat her to death. This act, which he later confessed to Thomas Gray, signified the total commitment of the general to the bloodshed. He was not merely a director, but a participant. As the morning of August 22nd progressed, the insurrectionists split into 2 groups to cover more ground, a tactical decision that increased their reach but diluted their strength. They swept through the farms of Henry Bryant, Richard Porter, and Levi Waller. At the Waller farm, a school was in session. The insurgents killed Mrs. Waller and 10 children. The death toll mounted rapidly, eventually reaching approximately 60 white men, women, and children. However, the alarm had been raised. The element of surprise, crucial to their success, evaporated with the rising sun. White families fled to the woods or fortified their homes. The local militia began to mobilize, joined by federal troops and sailors from the USS Natchez and USS Warren stationed in Norfolk. The turning point came near the plantation of Dr. Simon Blunt. Blunt's slaves, armed by their master, fought alongside him to repel the insurgents. This resistance from within the enslaved community was a strategic blow to Turner, who had hoped for a general uprising. The final decisive confrontation occurred at Parker's Field, near the Belmont Plantation. The insurgents, now numbering roughly 60 but disorganized and exhausted, were intercepted by the militia. In the ensuing skirmish, the rebel force was scattered. Many were killed or captured, others fled into the swamps. By Tuesday, August 23rd, less than 48 hours after it began, the rebellion was effectively suppressed. The reprisal was immediate and savage. White vigilante mobs and militia roamed the county, killing enslaved people indiscriminately. Estimates suggest that at least 120 black people, many of whom had no connection to the revolt, were slaughtered in the aftermath. Their heads were sometimes placed on poles at crossroads as gruesome warnings. Yet, amidst the chaos and the manhunt, the leader was missing. Nat Turner had vanished into the landscape he knew so well. The army was broken, the fields were stained with blood, and the county was under martial law. But the prophet remained at large, a ghost haunting the terrified imagination of the South. The narrative returns to the dark yard of the Travis plantation in the first hour of the insurrection. The two men who had been sent back by Nat Turner re-entered the silent house. They made their way to the cradle where the infant slept, the last surviving member of the Travis household. In accordance with the rebellion's brutal mandate that nits make lice, that no remnant of the oppressor should survive, they executed the child. They then exited the house, leaving behind a total silence, and rejoined the main group to continue the march that would eventually lead to their own destruction. Following the defeat at Parker's Field on August 23rd, Nat Turner evaded capture for over 2 months, a feat of extraordinary survival skills. While the militia scoured the swamps and woods, Turner did not flee to the north. Instead, he returned to the source. He dug a hole in the ground near the Travis farm, creating a makeshift cave beneath a pile of fence rails. For 6 weeks, he lived in this subterranean hideout. He emerged only at night to drink water and eavesdrop on the conversations of the search parties, gathering intelligence on the fate of his men. He was a fugitive in his own neighborhood, existing in a liminal space between life and death. He kept with him only his sword and his hope, though his supplies dwindled and his body wasted away. The end came on Sunday, October 30th, 1831, almost exactly 10 weeks after the rebellion began. A local farmer named Benjamin Phipps was walking his property when his dog began to bark furiously at a pile of fence rails. Turner, now emaciated and ragged, a mere scarecrow of his former self, emerged from the hole. He possessed his sword, but he offered no resistance. He surrendered to Phipps, perhaps realizing that the spiritual warfare had concluded and the earthly judgment was now inevitable. Turner was transported to the county jail in Jerusalem, now Cortland. There, he was interviewed by Thomas R. Gray, a lawyer and slaveholder who recognized the historical magnitude of the prisoner. Gray recorded Turner's confessions over a period of 3 days. The document is a complex historical artifact, a blend of Turner's apocalyptic rhetoric and Gray's legalistic framing, but it remains the primary source of Turner's voice. On November 11, 1831, Nat Turner was hanged from a tree in Jerusalem, Virginia. His death was not the end of the violence inflicted upon him. In a final act of desecration intended to strip him of his humanity, his body was reportedly beheaded, skinned, and quartered. There are historical accounts suggesting his skin was used to make souvenirs, such as purses or grease, a macabre attempt to commodify the man who had tried to destroy the commodity system. The aftermath of Nat Turner's rebellion transformed the American South. The Virginia legislature debated the abolition of slavery in 1832, not out of moral awakening, but out of fear. The measure failed. Instead, the South doubled down. New slave codes were enacted. It became illegal to teach an enslaved person to read or write. Black religious meetings were banned without white supervision, and the movement of free blacks was severely restricted. The rebellion shattered the myth of the contented slave that Southern apologists had used to defend the institution. It proved that the enslaved population was not docile, but waiting. Nat Turner's name became a symbol of the terrifying potential for retribution, a specter that haunted the slaveholding psyche until the Civil War finally brought the apocalypse he had predicted. The azure sun of 1831 had set, but the long shadow of the prophet of Southampton stretched across the decades, pointing inexorably toward the bloodshed of 1861. The first had not yet become last, but the seal had been broken, and the silence would never return.